The massive space station slowly turned in the darkness above the planet Kepler 442b. Its metal surface gleamed under the light of 3 distant suns. Inside the station, thousands of beings from across the galaxy moved through wide corridors. Some walked on 2 legs like humans. Others slithered on their bellies or floated in special tanks filled with green liquid. Ambassador Jake Morrison sat in his small quarters, looking out at the stars through a round window. His gray hair was neat and his uniform was clean, but his eyes showed the tiredness of a man who had seen too much. On his desk lay a stack of papers with bad news from human worlds far away. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks, knocked on the door and entered. She was young, maybe 30 years old, with short brown hair and worried eyes. She carried a tablet computer in her hands. "Sir, the latest reports from the outer colonies," she said quietly. Morrison took the tablet and read. His face grew darker with each line. 3 more human settlements had gone quiet in the past week. The pattern was always the same. First, the long-range communications stopped. Then the emergency beacons went dead. After that, nothing but silence. "How many does that make?" Morrison asked. 8 worlds in 3 years, sir. Nearly 2 million people. Morrison set down the tablet and rubbed his forehead. For 3 years he had stood before the Galactic Council asking for help. For 3 years they had given him the same answers. More committees, more studies, more time to think about the problem. The Drakmar Empire was eating up human worlds like a hungry animal. They came with big ships and powerful weapons. They bombed cities from space until nothing moved. Then they landed soldiers to take whatever they wanted. The few survivors were sold as slaves to other worlds. "The council meeting starts in 1 hour, Brooks said. "Do you want me to prepare the usual presentation?" Morrison stood up and walked to the window. Far below, the planet turned slowly. It was a peaceful world where different species had learned to live together. The Galactic Council had built their meeting place here as a symbol of cooperation and friendship. "No," Morrison said. "Not today." Brooks looked confused. "Sir?" "Today will be different, Lisa. Today we stop asking for permission." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She had worked with Morrison for 5 years. She knew that look. It was the same look he had when he made the hardest decisions. They walked through the station toward the council chamber. The hallways were full of aliens from dozens of different worlds. The tall, crystal-like Vexani moved in groups, their bodies glowing with soft blue light. The slug-like Garathi left wet trails on the floor as they slid along. The insect creatures, called Zephyrins, made clicking sounds with their mouths as they talked. Most of these beings looked at humans as the new kids in the galaxy. Humans had only joined the Galactic Council 60 years ago. To species that lived for centuries, that was like yesterday. They thought humans were young and foolish. They thought humans needed to learn patience. The council chamber was huge. It could hold 10,000 beings easily. The ceiling was so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top. Different species sat in different sections built for their needs. The Vexani were up high where they could catch more light. The water-breathing Aquari sat in tanks filled with their home ocean. The gas-breathing ethereals floated in sealed sections of the chamber. Morrison took his seat in the human section. There were only 12 humans in the entire council. Earth and its colonies had just a tiny voice compared to the great empires that ruled most of the galaxy. Speaker Veltar called the meeting to order. He was an Altarian, with a tall, thin body and long tentacles that moved like arms. His species was old and respected. They had been part of the council for over 1,000 years. "We gather today to discuss the ongoing situation in the outer rim territories," Veltar said in his musical voice. The chair recognizes the representative from the Vexani Collective. Ambassador Kethvar rose from the crystal section. Her body was like living glass, beautiful and cold. When she spoke, her voice sounded like wind chimes. The Vexani Collective believes that hasty action leads only to greater suffering. We propose sending another fact-finding mission to study the Drakmar situation. With proper research, we can understand their motivations and find a peaceful solution. Many beings in the chamber made sounds of agreement. The Garathi delegation bubbled with approval. The Zephyrins clicked their mandibles in support. Morrison felt his hands tighten into fists. Another fact-finding mission. Another study. Another excuse to do nothing while human children died. The representative from the Garathi Commonwealth spoke next. His slug-like body glistened with nervous slime as he talked about increasing humanitarian aid to refugee camps. The camps were full of survivors from worlds the Drakmar had already destroyed. Then came the Zephyrin Patriarch, an ancient insect with scarred wings and cloudy eyes. He buzzed about the importance of maintaining galactic peace. He said that war was never the answer. Violence only led to more violence. Morrison had heard these same speeches for 3 years. Pretty words about peace and understanding. High-minded talk about diplomatic solutions. Meanwhile, human worlds burned and human people died. Brooks leaned over and whispered in his ear, "Sir, we just lost contact with Haven Colony. Population 400,000. Haven Colony." Morrison remembered visiting there 2 years ago. Families farming the rich soil under a golden sun. Children playing in clean streets. Artists painting the beautiful landscapes. Now it was probably just smoke and ash. Speaker Veltar's tentacles waved as he looked around the chamber. "Are there any other statements before we move to vote on the Vexani proposal?" This was the moment. Morrison could stand up and give another speech asking for help. He could present more evidence of Drakmar crimes. He could beg these ancient species to take action. Or he could do something different. Morrison stood up slowly. His movement caught the attention of the entire chamber. Thousands of eyes and sensors turned toward the small human section. "The chair recognizes Ambassador Morrison of the Terran Federation," Veltar announced. Morrison walked down the long ramp toward the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet. Every being in the room watched him approach. The speaking platform. He reached the podium and placed his hands on its smooth surface. The platform lifted him up so that every creature in the massive chamber could see him clearly. Cameras recorded his image to be broadcast across the galaxy. Morrison looked out at the sea of alien faces. He saw the glowing Vexani in their crystal towers. He saw the wet bulk of the Garathi representatives. He saw the ancient Zephyrins with their multifaceted eyes. These beings had lived for centuries. Their civilizations were older than human history. They thought they knew everything about war and peace. They thought they understood the galaxy better than the young human species. Today, Morrison would teach them something new. He opened his mouth to speak, and the fate of the galaxy hung on his next words. Morrison stood at the podium and looked out at the thousands of alien beings watching him. The chamber was so quiet he could hear the soft humming of the air recycling systems. His heart beat fast in his chest, but his voice was calm when he began to speak. "Honored delegates," he said. "I have stood before this council many times over the past 3 years. I have spoken of friendship between our species. I have talked about the bonds of trade and cooperation that connect our worlds." The aliens listened politely. They expected another speech asking for help. Morrison had given dozens of similar speeches before. Always polite, always respectful, always following the proper diplomatic rules. When humanity first joined this council 60 years ago, we were young and eager to learn. We studied your languages and customs. We opened our worlds to your traders and scientists. We shared our music, our art, our dreams of a peaceful galaxy. Ambassador Kethvar from the Vexani shifted in her crystal seat. Her body pulsed with soft blue light as she listened. She had heard Morrison speak before. He was always reasonable, always willing to compromise. "We believed in the power of words to solve problems," Morrison continued. "We believed that civilized beings could work together to stop violence and protect the innocent. We believed in the mission of this council." The Garathi representative bubbled quietly to his aide. This sounded like another request for a strongly worded letter to the Drakmar Empire. The slug-like beings had written many such letters over the years. They were very good at expressing disappointment in diplomatic language. Morrison activated his holographic display. Images appeared in the air above the podium, visible to every being in the chamber. The first image showed a human colony world before the Drakmar attack. Green fields stretched to the horizon. Children played in parks. Families walked through busy markets. This was New Geneva Colony, Morrison said. Population 800,000. Farmers, teachers, artists, scientists. People who had never hurt anyone. People who believed they were protected by galactic law. The next image showed the same world after the Drakmar bombardment. Blackened craters marked where cities once stood. Smoke rose from burning forests. Nothing moved in the dead landscape. This is New Geneva today, Morrison said. The Drakmar ships arrived 3 weeks ago. They demanded complete surrender. When the colonists asked for time to evacuate civilians, the Drakmar opened fire. Some of the younger aliens in the chamber made sounds of distress. The older representatives remained silent. They had seen many wars over the centuries. Death and destruction were nothing new to them. Morrison showed more images. Colony after colony reduced to ash and ruin. Refugee ships crowded with the few survivors. Mass graves where the Drakmar had buried their victims. 8 worlds, Morrison said. 2 million human beings, dead or missing or sold into slavery, all while this council debated the proper diplomatic response. Speaker Veltar's tentacles twitched with discomfort. Ambassador Morrison, we understand your frustration, but surely you recognize that military action would only escalate the situation. The Drakmar are a powerful empire. War with them would bring suffering to many species. Morrison turned to face the speaker directly. And what about the suffering happening right now? What about the human children being sold in slave markets? What about the families torn apart by Drakmar raids? These are tragic events, Kethavar said, her crystal body glowing brighter. But the Vexani have seen what happens when young species act without wisdom. Patience and careful planning prevent greater disasters. Morrison felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. These beings would never understand. They lived for centuries. To them, a few years of human suffering was barely worth noticing. They could afford to be patient because it was not their people dying. Patience, Morrison repeated. You want us to be patient while our worlds burn. You want us to wait while our people are murdered. You want us to trust in your wisdom while you do nothing. The chamber began to stir with uncomfortable sounds. This was not how diplomatic speeches usually went. Morrison was supposed to be polite and respectful. He was supposed to follow the rules. We filed formal complaints, Morrison said, his voice growing louder. We attended committee meetings. We participated in working groups and study panels. We followed every procedure in your diplomatic handbook. He pulled out a thick book and held it up for all to see. 1,500 pages of rules about proper diplomatic conduct. 1,500 pages explaining how civilized beings should resolve their differences. Morrison threw the book down on the podium with a loud thud that echoed through the chamber. And while we followed your rules, the Drakmar followed none. They ignored your letters. They laughed at your sanctions. They kept killing our people while you debated the correct way to ask them to stop. The old Zephyrin patriarch buzzed angrily. Ambassador Morrison, you forget yourself. This council has maintained galactic peace for over 2,000 years. Our methods work because they prevent the chaos of war. Morrison stepped closer to the edge of the platform. His gray eyes swept across the alien faces watching him. Peace for who? Your methods work fine when the victims are too weak to matter. When the Drakmar attacked the Kalani agricultural worlds 5 years ago, you offered humanitarian aid and sent fact-finding missions. The Kalani were absorbed into the Drakmar Empire. Problem solved. Several alien delegates shifted uncomfortably. The fate of the Kalani was not often discussed in council sessions. When the Drakmar enslaved the Miralans, you expressed deep concern and called for dialogue. The Miralans stopped complaining because most of them were dead. Another successful diplomatic solution. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the vast chamber. Your peace has been built on the graves of species too small to fight back, too weak to matter, too few to threaten your comfortable order. Speaker Veltar raised his tentacles for silence. Ambassador Morrison, these accusations are inappropriate. This council has always acted in the best interests of galactic stability. Stability, Morrison said with bitter laughter. Is that what you call watching small civilizations get eaten by predators? Is that what you call standing by while monsters destroy entire worlds? He activated another holographic display. This time it showed intelligence reports from human, spy networks, Drakmar fleet movements, resource extraction operations on conquered worlds, slave trading routes. We tried your way for 3 years, Morrison said. We followed your rules and trusted your wisdom. Meanwhile, we used that time to prepare for what we knew would eventually come. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the background hum of machinery seemed to quiet down. The Terran Federation formally withdraws from all mutual defense agreements with member species, Morrison announced. We invoke Article 12 of the Galactic Charter, allowing for unilateral action in defense of our sovereign territory. A wave of shocked sounds swept through the chamber. Clicking, buzzing, bubbling, and harmonics as different species expressed their alarm in their own ways. Kethavar stood up quickly, her crystal body blazing with bright light. Ambassador Morrison, surely you cannot mean to suggest military action without council approval. Such behavior violates every principle of civilized conduct. Morrison looked up at her glowing form. His weathered face was calm, but his eyes burned with cold fire. The time for civilized conduct ended when you chose to do nothing while our people died. The time for diplomatic solutions ended when you decided our lives did not matter. He paused and let his words sink in. Every camera in the chamber focused on his face. His next words would be heard across the galaxy. The time for diplomacy has ended, Morrison said clearly. It's time for war. The Galactic Council chamber erupted in chaos after Morrison's declaration. Alien voices rose in angry buzzing, clicking, and harmonic wails. Speaker Veltar slammed his ceremonial staff against the podium repeatedly, trying to restore order. Ambassador Morrison, Veltar called out over the noise. The Terran Federation cannot simply declare war without council approval. There are procedures, there are laws. Morrison looked up at the speaker with cold eyes. The same laws that protected our colonies? The same procedures that saved 2 million human lives? He shook his head. We're done with your laws. Within hours of Morrison's speech, the news spread across the galaxy. On the diplomatic station, alien delegations held emergency meetings. Some species threatened to cut trade with humanity. Others warned of economic sanctions. A few quietly began moving their own fleets away from human space. Far from the council chambers, the real war was already beginning. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood on the bridge of the battleship UES Defiance, watching star charts on the main display. She was 55 years old with short gray hair and sharp blue eyes. She had known Jake Morrison since they were both cadets at the Titan Academy 30 years ago. Admiral, her communications officer called out, "We're receiving deployment orders from Earth Command." Sullivan nodded. She had been expecting this moment for months. While the diplomats talked, the military had been preparing. Human ships had been quietly moving into position throughout Federation space. Signal the fleet, she ordered. Operation Payback is now active. The human fleet was small compared to the great armadas of older species. Only 47 ships scattered across a dozen star systems. But these ships were different from anything the galaxy had seen before. The Drakmar Empire had built their fleet for traditional space warfare. Massive dreadnoughts with thick armor and powerful energy weapons. They fought like ancient knights, meeting their enemies head-on in thunderous battles. Humans had studied every major war in galactic history. They learned from the mistakes of conquered species. While other civilizations built bigger and stronger ships, humans built smarter ones. Captain Ryan Hayes commanded the destroyer UES Vigilant, leading a small squadron toward the Drakmar supply depot at Kepler Station. His ship was only 300 meters long, tiny compared to Drakmar battlecruisers. Approaching the target zone, his navigator reported. Drakmar patrol ships detected, 3 heavy cruisers and 6 escort vessels. On paper, it was no contest. The Drakmar ships outweighed Hayes' squadron by 20-1. Their weapons could punch through human armor like paper. Their shields could absorb punishment that would destroy smaller vessels. But Hayes smiled as he watched the enemy formation on his screen. Activate phase drive. Execute attack pattern Gamma. The human ships seemed to flicker and disappear. For a few seconds, they existed in a parallel dimension, where Drakmar sensors could not track them. When they reappeared, they were inside the enemy formation. The Drakmar commanders had never seen anything like it. Their massive ships were designed to fight enemies who approached from a distance. They had no defense against vessels that could appear anywhere without warning. Hazes, squadrons struck like lightning. Precise energy beams disabled the Drakmar engines. Guided missiles targeted weapon systems and communication arrays. Within minutes, the enemy patrol was helpless. But the humans did not destroy the Drakmar ships. Instead, they captured them. Boarding. Parties away, Hayes ordered. Secure all prisoners and intelligence data. Leave the ships intact. This was another human innovation that confused their enemies. Most species in the galaxy fought to destroy or be destroyed. Humans fought to win with minimum waste. On the Planet Haven colony, Colonel Amy Torres led 2,000 human Marines in the first ground assault against Drakmar occupation forces. The enemy had 10,000 soldiers dug into defensive positions around the main city. Traditional military doctrine said the humans needed at least 3-to-1 odds to attack fortified positions. The Drakmar commanders felt confident behind their energy barriers and automated gun turrets. Torres had different ideas. Her Marines did not charge the enemy positions. Instead, they disappeared into the forests and mountains around the city. For 3 days, nothing happened. The Drakmar waited for the human attack that never came. On the 4th night, the water treatment plant stopped working. On the 5th night, the power generators failed. On the 6th night, the communication network went dead. The Drakmar found themselves isolated in the dark, drinking recycled water and eating emergency rations. Their mighty fortress had become a prison. Torres' Marines had not fought a single battle. They had simply turned off the machines that kept the occupation force alive. Attention, Drakmar Commander. Torres broadcast on emergency frequencies. Your situation is hopeless. Surrender now and your soldiers will be treated according to galactic law. Continue resistance and we will leave you in the dark until you starve. The Drakmar war leader. Gathakmor had conquered 12 worlds for the Empire. He had never surrendered to anyone, but he had never faced an enemy who could make his own weapons useless without firing a shot. After 8 days without power or communication, Gathakmor ordered his forces to lay down their arms. Back on the diplomatic station, Ambassador Morrison faced a council in complete confusion. The Vexani representative demanded an immediate ceasefire. The Garathi threatened economic sanctions. The Zephyrin patriarch buzzed frantically about the breakdown of galactic order. Ambassador Morrison, Speaker Veltar said, his tentacles writhing with agitation. Your fleet actions violate every principle of civilized warfare. These surprise attacks and unconventional tactics are unseemly. Morrison almost laughed. Unseemly? You're worried about proper military etiquette while our people were being slaughtered? Keithavar's crystal body pulsed with angry red light. The Vexani Collective demands that humanity cease these barbaric tactics immediately. War should be conducted with honor and dignity. Honor? Morrison repeated. Where was the honor when the Drakmar bombed refugee camps? Where was the dignity when they sold children into slavery? The truth was that human tactics were working better than anyone had imagined. While the Council debated proper behavior, human forces were winning victories across the Outer Rim. Captain Sarah Kim's intelligence ship had intercepted Drakmar communications and learned their fleet movements weeks in advance. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Davis had trained local resistance fighters on occupied worlds, turning entire populations against their conquerors. Commander Lisa Park's engineers had developed new weapons that could disable enemy ships without destroying them. Most importantly, humanity had done something unprecedented in galactic history. They had inspired other species to fight back. The peaceful Kalani farmers began sabotaging Drakmar supply convoys. The quiet Miralans started sharing intelligence with human forces. Even some younger members of Council species were secretly volunteering for joint operations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a human xenobiologist, worked with Kalani scientists to develop biological weapons that only affected Drakmar physiology. Engineer Tom Wilson helped Miralan rebels build communication networks that the Empire could not detect. The galaxy was learning that humans did not just fight differently, they fought together with anyone willing to stand against oppression. Morrison received daily reports from Admiral Sullivan about the war's progress. 3 Drakmar fleet bases had been captured, 12 occupied worlds had been liberated. Enemy morale was collapsing as their soldiers faced tactics they could not understand or counter. The Drakmar are requesting a meeting, Sullivan told him over encrypted communication. Their war commander wants to discuss terms. Morrison nodded. He had expected this moment. The Drakmar Empire was learning what humans had known for centuries. The strongest army in the world could not defeat an enemy it could not catch. The biggest guns were useless if you could not aim them at your target. Set up the meeting, Morrison told her. But make sure they understand one thing. We're not here to negotiate. We're here to dictate terms. For the first time in 3 years, Morrison allowed himself to smile. The galaxy was about to learn that humans were much more dangerous as enemies than they had ever been as friends. 6 months after Morrison's declaration of war, the Great Council chamber on Concordia Prime looked very different. The same alien species sat in their familiar sections, but the mood had changed completely. Gone was the comfortable certainty that had ruled the galaxy for centuries. In its place was nervous tension and worried whispers. War Commander Thakdul of the Drakmar Empire stood at the center of the chamber where Morrison had made his famous speech. The massive warrior's shell was cracked and scarred from recent battles. His 4 arms hung at his sides in a gesture of defeat that shocked the watching delegates. Morrison sat in the human section, looking older than he had 6 months ago. His hair was completely white now, and new lines marked his face, but his eyes held the quiet satisfaction of a man who had proven his point. The Drakmar Empire formally requests an immediate end to all hostile actions against our forces, Thakdul announced in his deep, grinding voice. We propose a return to peaceful relations between our species. The chamber fell silent. Many of the alien delegates could not believe what they were hearing. The Drakmar Empire had not lost a war in over 200 years. They had conquered dozens of species and enslaved entire star systems. Now they were asking for peace from the humans they had tried to destroy. Speaker Veltar's tentacles trembled as he processed the request. War Commander Thakdul, are you speaking for the entire Drakmar Empire? Does your emperor approve this surrender? Thakdul's compound eyes darkened with shame. The emperor has authorized me to negotiate an end to hostilities. The human forces have proven more difficult than anticipated. Morrison almost smiled at the understatement. Difficult was not the word he would have used. Devastating might be more accurate. The human war campaign had been unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Traditional military thinking said that smaller forces could not defeat larger ones. The humans had ignored traditional thinking completely. Admiral Sullivan's fleet had never fought a major battle. Instead, they had appeared where the enemy least expected them, struck critical targets, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Drakmar commanders found themselves fighting ghosts that hit them everywhere and nowhere at once. Colonel Torres had liberated 15 occupied worlds without losing a single major engagement. Her ground forces used tactics that the enemy could not counter. They turned the Drakmar's own infrastructure against them, making their weapons useless and their fortifications into prisons. Most importantly, the humans had awakened something that had been sleeping in the galaxy for centuries: hope. The Kalani had risen up against their Drakmar occupiers, using human-trained fighters to drive the Empire from their homeworld. The Miralans had established a new government and declared independence from Drakmar rule. Even species that had been conquered decades ago were beginning to rebel. "What are your terms?" Morrison asked, standing up slowly. Thakdul looked at the human ambassador with something that might have been respect. 6 months ago, he would have crushed Morrison like an insect. Now he was asking for mercy from the species he had tried to exterminate. "We propose a return to the previous boundaries," the war commander said. "The Drakmar Empire will withdraw from all Terran Federation territory. In exchange, human forces will cease their attacks on our remaining holdings." Morrison walked down to the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed in the silence as thousands of alien eyes watched him approach the speaking platform. Unacceptable, Morrison said simply. Tactile scarred shell bristled with surprise. You reject our offer of peace? I reject your definition of peace, Morrison replied. Withdrawing from human worlds is not enough. Not anymore. He activated the holographic display and showed images from across the galaxy. Kalani farmers celebrating their freedom. Miralan children playing in schools that had been closed for decades. Former slaves building new lives on liberated worlds. The war changed something, Morrison said. It showed smaller species that they did not have to accept oppression. It proved that bullies could be defeated if people were willing to stand together. Ambassador Kethvar rose from her crystal seat, her body pulsing with agitated light. Surely, Ambassador Morrison does not expect the complete dissolution of the Drakmar Empire. Such a demand would destabilize the entire galactic order. Morrison turned to face her directly. The galactic order that allowed genocide and slavery? The order that protected predators and ignored victims? That order needed to be destabilized. Speaker Veltar's tentacles writhed with distress. Ambassador Morrison, the Council cannot support such extreme demands. The Drakmar Empire has legitimate territorial claims that must be respected. Legitimate? Morrison's voice carried clearly through the vast chamber. Based on what? Their right to conquer weaker species, their tradition of enslaving entire populations. He looked around at the assembled delegates, seeing the fear in their alien faces. They were afraid of humans now, and Morrison was glad. Fear would keep them honest. Here are the terms of the Terran Federation, Morrison announced. All occupied. Worlds will hold free elections within 1 year. All slaves will be released immediately and given passage to worlds of their choosing. All Drakmar military forces will withdraw to their original core systems. Takdul's forearms clenched into fists. These terms are impossible. The Empire cannot simply abandon centuries of territorial expansion. Then the war continues, Morrison said calmly. But understand this, War Commander. Human forces are not going to stop with defensive actions anymore. We have proven we can defeat your fleets. We have shown we can liberate your conquered worlds. How long do you think your core systems will remain safe? The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Every being in the chamber understood what Morrison was saying. Humans had held back their full strength during the liberation campaign. They had fought to free occupied worlds, not to destroy the Drakmar completely. But that restraint could end. Tactile looked around the chamber, seeking support from the other species. He found only worried silence. The great powers that had maintained galactic stability for centuries were not going to risk human anger to save the Drakmar Empire. We accept your terms, the War Commander said finally. Morrison nodded once. Good. The ceasefire begins immediately. Human observers will monitor the withdrawal process. Any violations will result in resumed hostilities. The formal ceremony took 3 hours as lawyers and diplomats worked out the specific details. But the real negotiation was already over. The Drakmar Empire, which had terrorized the galaxy for 2 centuries, had been brought to its knees by a species most beings had considered primitive. As the session ended, Morrison found himself approached by delegates from smaller species. The Kalani representative, an elderly farmer named Grethka, spoke for many of them. Ambassador Morrison, Grethka said in accented but clear standard. My people want to thank the humans for showing us that freedom was possible. We had almost forgotten what it felt like to hope. Morrison shook the alien's 3-fingered hand. Hope is something you have to keep for yourself. We just reminded you that bullies can be beaten if you're willing to fight. Later that evening, Morrison stood in the observation deck of the Diplomatic station with Admiral Sullivan. They watched the stars through the transparent aluminum windows, sharing a quiet drink and reflecting on what they had accomplished. Think they'll remember this lesson? Sullivan asked, sipping her coffee. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile he had worn in months. For a while, and when they forget, we'll be here to remind them. The galaxy had learned something important in the past 6 months. Humanity was not the naive junior species seeking approval from ancient civilizations. They were humans, and they would defend their own with whatever force was necessary. More importantly, they would defend anyone else willing to stand up for freedom. The age of quiet oppression was over. The age of human-led resistance had begun. Outside, the window, human ships moved in formation with vessels from a dozen liberated species. The fleet was small compared to the great armadas of the major powers, but it carried something more valuable than weapons. It carried hope.